The late afternoon sun beat down on the small town of Millbrook, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of Main Street. Marcus Williams sat quietly in his old pickup truck at a red light, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel. At 62 years old, his dark skin showed the lines of a life well lived, and his gray hair was cut military short, just as it had been for the past 40 years. The Purple Heart medal hung from his rearview mirror, swaying gently with each breath of wind that came through the half-open window. Marcus had just come from the Veterans Affairs office downtown, where he volunteered every Tuesday and Thursday, helping younger veterans navigate the complex paperwork required for their benefits. It was his way of giving back, of making sure that those who served after him didn't have to struggle alone the way he once had. The manila folder on his passenger seat contained applications for 3 young men who had recently returned from overseas, each one carrying invisible wounds that Marcus understood all too well. The light turned green, and Marcus pressed gently on the accelerator. His truck moved forward at a steady, careful pace. He was in no rush. Retirement had taught him that the world didn't end if you took your time, if you noticed the flowers growing through the fence at Miller's Hardware, or if you waved at Mrs. Chen sweeping the sidewalk in front of her restaurant. These small moments of peace were what he had fought for all those years ago, even if the country he returned to hadn't always recognized his sacrifice. Officer Derek Thornton sat in his patrol car 3 blocks away, his jaw clenched tight as he scrolled through his phone. At 34, he had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 8 years, and in his mind he had been passed over for promotion too many times. The sergeant position had gone to Rodriguez last month, and Derek was still bitter about it. He told himself it was because of politics, because of quotas, because the department was trying to look diverse. It never occurred to him that his attitude might be the problem. Derek looked up from his phone and noticed Marcus's truck passing by. Something about it annoyed him immediately. Maybe it was the way the old truck moved so slowly, or maybe it was something else entirely, something Derek wouldn't admit even to himself. He pulled out from his parking spot and began following the truck, his eyes narrowing as he looked for any reason to make a stop. Marcus noticed the patrol car in his rearview mirror but thought nothing of it. He had been pulled over twice in the past year, both times for reasons that seemed to evaporate once the officers saw his veteran identification. He assumed it would be the same this time, if it came to that. He signaled properly as he turned onto Oakwood Avenue, heading toward the community center where he taught a weekly class on American history to high school students struggling with the subject. Derek hit his lights. The red and blue flashed across the quiet street, and Marcus felt his heart sink just a little. He had done nothing wrong. He was certain of that, but the familiar feeling of frustration washed over him anyway. He pulled over carefully, put the truck in park, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. It was a routine he had learned long ago, a survival technique that shouldn't have been necessary but was. The officer approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his belt. Marcus kept his hands visible and his expression neutral. Derek looked down at him with cold eyes, already seeing what he wanted to see rather than what was actually there. "License and registration," Derek said, his voice flat and unfriendly. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop. "May I ask what I did wrong, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, his voice carrying the patience of someone who had been through this before. "Just give me your documents," Derek snapped back, his tone growing hostile. "Don't make this difficult." Marcus slowly reached for his glove compartment, moving deliberately so there would be no misunderstanding. He pulled out his registration and then retrieved his wallet from his pocket, extracting his driver's license. As he handed them over, Derek snatched them from his hand without a word. Derek walked back to his patrol car and sat down, taking far longer than necessary to run the information. He was hoping for warrants, for unpaid tickets, for anything that would justify what he was feeling. But the record came back clean, completely clean. Marcus Williams had no criminal history whatsoever, not even a parking ticket in the past 5 years. This somehow made Derek angrier. He got out of his car and approached the truck again, this time with even more aggression in his posture. Marcus remained calm, his military training helping him maintain his composure even as he felt the situation growing more tense. "Step out of the vehicle," Derek ordered. "Officer, I don't understand what this is about," Marcus said, his voice still level but now carrying a note of concern. "I wasn't speeding. My vehicle is registered. What's the problem?" "I said get out of the truck," Derek shouted, his hand moving closer to his weapon. Marcus complied slowly, opening his door and stepping down onto the pavement. At 6 feet tall, he stood eye to eye with Derek, but he kept his posture non-threatening, his hand slightly raised and visible. Other people on the street were beginning to notice the commotion. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the flower shop, stood in her doorway watching with concern. Derek began to search Marcus roughly, patting him down with unnecessary force. Marcus said nothing, simply endured it, knowing that any protest could escalate the situation dangerously. When Derek found nothing, he seemed even more frustrated. "What's this?" Derek said, pointing at the Purple Heart hanging from the rearview mirror. His tone was mocking, disbelieving. "It's my Purple Heart medal, officer," Marcus replied quietly. "I served in Vietnam." Derek laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that made several onlookers gasp. "Sure you did," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I bet you bought that at a pawn shop." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest but pushed it down. He had faced enemies in the jungle who wanted to kill him, had watched friends die, had earned that medal by taking shrapnel that nearly ended his life. And now this young officer was mocking his service, his sacrifice, as if it meant nothing. "I assure you, officer, that medal is real. I can show you my military identification if you'd like," Marcus offered, trying to de-escalate. "I don't want to see anything from you," Derek spat. Then, in a moment that seemed to happen in slow motion, he did something that would change both their lives forever. Derek stepped closer to Marcus and spat directly in his face. The warm saliva hit Marcus's cheek, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The street went completely silent. Mrs. Patterson dropped her watering can. A young mother walking with her stroller stopped dead in her tracks. Even the birds seemed to pause their singing. Marcus stood there, this decorated war hero, this man who had given years of his life to his country, with another man's spit running down his face. Marcus slowly raised his hand and wiped his cheek, with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving Derek's. He said nothing because there was nothing to say. The humiliation was complete, and Derek seemed satisfied with himself, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. What Derek didn't know was that everything was about to change. What he didn't realize was that karma doesn't always wait for tomorrow. Sometimes it arrives in 5 minutes, swift and undeniable, carrying the weight of justice that has been too long delayed. Marcus stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. The spit had dried on his face in the warm afternoon air, but the humiliation burned fresh. He had survived ambushes in the Vietnamese jungle, had pulled wounded soldiers from rice paddies under enemy fire, had earned medals for valor that this young officer had just mocked and dismissed. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal on a street in the country he had bled for. Derek walked back toward his patrol car, that satisfied smirk still on his face. He was about to get in when a black sedan pulled up behind his vehicle. The car door opened, and a tall woman in a crisp business suit stepped out. She was in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she didn't miss much. Her badge was clipped to her belt, and even from a distance, Marcus could see it was federal. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez had been driving through Millbrook on her way back to the regional office when she spotted the traffic stop. Something about the officer's aggressive posture had caught her attention, and her instincts, honed by 15 years with the FBI, told her to pull over and observe. What she witnessed in the next 30 seconds made her blood run cold. She saw Derek spit in Marcus's face, saw the way the older man stood there absorbing the abuse with quiet dignity, and she saw the small crowd of witnesses standing frozen in shock. Rebecca approached quickly, her badge held high. "Federal agent," she announced, her voice carrying authority that made Derek spin around in surprise. "I need to see your badge number, officer." Derek's face went from smug satisfaction to confusion to panic in the span of 3 seconds. This is a local matter, ma'am. I don't know what you think you saw, but I saw you assault a civilian," Rebecca cut him off, her voice cold as ice. "I watched you spit in that man's face. That's battery at minimum, and given that you're in uniform, it's also abuse of authority." "He was resisting," Derek lied quickly, scrambling for any excuse. "He wouldn't comply with my orders." "I observed the entire interaction from my vehicle," Rebecca stated flatly. "The gentleman was completely cooperative. He complied with every instruction you gave him." She turned to Marcus, her expression softening slightly. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, I'm fine. Just want to go home." "I understand, but I'm going to need you to stay for a few minutes while I sort this out," Rebecca said gently, then turned back to Derek with steel in her eyes. "Give me your badge number now." Derek's hand trembled slightly as he recited the numbers. Rebecca wrote them down in a small notebook, then took several photographs with her phone, documenting the scene, the patrol car, and Derek's name tag. She then approached the gathered witnesses. "Excuse me, did any of you see what happened here?" she asked the small crowd. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward immediately, her elderly face flushed with anger. "I saw the whole thing," she said, her voice shaking. "That officer spit right in Mr. Williams's face for no reason at all. Marcus wasn't doing anything wrong. He's a good man, a veteran. This is disgraceful." The young mother with the stroller nodded vigorously. "I saw it too. I have it on my phone. I started recording when the officer began yelling." She held up her smartphone and Rebecca's eyes lit up. "Ma'am, would you be willing to send that video to me? It could be important evidence," Rebecca said, handing the woman her card. "Absolutely," the young mother replied. "This kind of behavior is exactly why people don't trust the police anymore. Not all officers, but ones like him. They make it bad for everyone." Derek's face had gone pale. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. There was video evidence. There was a federal agent. There were multiple witnesses. His career was circling the drain, and he knew it. Rebecca made a phone call, stepping away but keeping Derek in her line of sight. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, this one containing Sergeant Rodriguez, the man who had gotten the promotion Derek wanted so badly. Rodriguez got out of his vehicle and immediately assessed the situation. When Rebecca showed him her badge and explained what she had witnessed, his expression turned grave. "Williams," Rodriguez said, looking past the commotion to Marcus. "Marcus Williams? The Marcus Williams who teaches at the community center?" Marcus nodded, finally speaking. "Yes, that's me." Rodriguez's face went through several emotions at once. He walked over to Marcus, genuine concern in his eyes. "Sir, I am so sorry. This is not acceptable. Not in my department, not anywhere." He turned to Derek with barely contained fury. "Thornton, you're suspended immediately pending investigation. Give me your badge and your weapon. Right now." "Sarge, you don't understand. He was—" Derek started, but Rodriguez cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I don't want to hear it. Agent Martinez witnessed the incident. There's video evidence. There are civilian witnesses. You're done talking." Rodriguez held out his hand expectantly, and Derek, his hands now shaking visibly, unclipped his badge and handed over his service weapon. Rebecca stepped forward. "Sergeant, I'll be filing a formal complaint with your department and with the district attorney's office. This officer committed assault and battery under color of authority. Those are serious charges. I understand, Agent. He'll face the full consequences of his actions," Rodriguez promised. He then did something that surprised everyone. He walked over to Marcus and extended his hand. "Mr. Williams, I've heard about your work with veterans and with the kids at the community center. My nephew was one of your students last year. You helped him pass his history class and get into college. What happened here today is a disgrace to the uniform and everything we're supposed to stand for." Marcus shook his hand, the first genuine respect he had been shown by law enforcement that day. "I appreciate that, Sergeant." Derek stood by his patrol car, his world crumbling around him. The badge he had worn with such arrogance was now in his sergeant's pocket. His weapon, which he had threatened Marcus with, was secured in Rodriguez's vehicle. His career in law enforcement was effectively over, and he knew criminal charges were likely coming. All because of his hatred, his prejudice, his inability to see the humanity in another person. Rebecca approached Marcus once more. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come down to give a formal statement. I know this has been traumatic and I apologize for extending this ordeal, but your testimony will be crucial." I understand, Marcus said quietly. I've been through worse, Agent. Much worse. I believe you have, Rebecca said, glancing at the Purple Heart still hanging in his truck.
Is that yours, sir?
Yes, ma'am. Vietnam, 1968. Rebecca stood a bit straighter. My father served in Vietnam. Came home in 1970. He never talked much about it, but I know what it cost him. Thank you for your service, Mr. Williams. Truly. Marcus nodded, accepting the gratitude with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout this entire ordeal. As he stood there on that sidewalk, surrounded by concerned neighbors and respectful officers, something shifted in the air. The crowd that had gathered began to grow. Word was spreading through the small town like wildfire. The local newspaper editor, who had been having coffee at the shop across the street, was already on his phone making calls. The story was getting out, and once it did, there would be no containing it. Derek sat in the back of Rodriguez's patrol car now, no longer a police officer but a suspect. Through the window he could see people pointing at him, could hear the murmur of angry voices. 5 minutes ago he had been in control, wielding power he felt entitled to. Now he was powerless, facing consequences he had never imagined would apply to him. Karma hadn't just struck. It had hit like a freight train, and the impact was only just beginning. The story exploded across social media before the sun had even set that evening. The young mother's video, showing Derek spitting in Marcus's face while the older man stood there calmly, went viral within hours. It had everything that made people pay attention. Clear injustice, undeniable evidence, and a victim whose dignity shone through despite the humiliation. By morning, the video had been viewed over 2 million times, and that number was climbing fast. Marcus sat in his modest living room that night, his phone buzzing constantly with calls and messages. His daughter Jennifer, who lived 3 hours away in the city, had called him in tears after seeing the video. His former commanding officer from Vietnam had reached out, furious on his behalf. Veterans groups across the country were sharing the story, and many were calling for Derek's prosecution. The American Legion, the VFW, and dozens of other organizations were issuing statements condemning the officer's actions. Marcus felt overwhelmed by it all. He had never wanted this kind of attention. He had simply wanted to live his quiet life, help other veterans, teach kids about history, and enjoy his retirement in peace. Now his face was on every news channel, and reporters were camping outside his house hoping for an interview. Jennifer arrived early the next morning, letting herself in with her key. She found her father sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and staring out the window at the growing crowd of media vans on his street. She hugged him tightly, and for a moment this strong man who had survived war and discrimination let himself lean on his daughter's strength. "Dad, you need to tell your story," Jennifer said softly. "People need to hear from you. They need to know who you really are. They can see the video. That tells them everything they need to know." Marcus replied, his voice tired. "No, Dad, the video shows what that officer did to you, but it doesn't show who you are. It doesn't show the 40 years you served in the military. It doesn't show the hundreds of veterans you've helped. It doesn't show the kids whose lives you've changed. You need to tell people your story." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right. Maybe this is bigger than just me and that officer." That afternoon, Marcus gave a press conference on his front porch. Cameras from every major news network were there, along with reporters from newspapers and online publications. He stood there in a simple button-down shirt, his military service cap on his head, and spoke from the heart. "My name is Marcus Williams. I'm 62 years old. I served in the United States Army for 23 years, including 2 tours in Vietnam. I was wounded in action and received the Purple Heart. After I retired from the military, I worked as a counselor at the VA, helping veterans transition back to civilian life. For the past 10 years, I've volunteered my time helping young veterans and teaching history to students who need extra support." He paused, looking at the crowd of reporters and neighbors who had gathered. "What happened to me yesterday happens to too many people in this country. Good people who have done nothing wrong get treated with suspicion and disrespect simply because of the color of their skin. I'm not the first, and sadly I won't be the last. But maybe, just maybe, if we shine a light on these incidents, if we hold people accountable for their actions, things can start to change." A reporter shouted a question. "Mr. Williams, do you want the officer prosecuted?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "I want justice. I want accountability. That officer abused his authority and assaulted me without cause. Yes, I believe he should face legal consequences. But more than that, I want this to be a teaching moment. I want police departments across the country to look at this incident and ask themselves how they can do better. I want officers to see people as human beings first, not as threats or stereotypes. Another reporter called out, "How do you feel about him losing his job?" "Actions have consequences," Marcus said simply. He made a choice. Now he has to live with the results of that choice. I don't take pleasure in anyone losing their livelihood. But I also can't ignore the fact that someone with that much hatred and prejudice in their heart shouldn't have the power and authority of a police badge. The questions continued for nearly an hour, and Marcus answered each one with thoughtful consideration. He never raised his voice, never expressed hatred toward Derek, but he was unflinching in his demand for accountability and change. By the time the press conference ended, Marcus Williams had become more than just a victim of police abuse. He had become a symbol of dignified resistance and a voice calling for meaningful reform. Meanwhile, Derek Thornton's life was falling apart in spectacular fashion. His suspension had turned into termination within 24 hours. The video had made it impossible for the police department to do anything less. The district attorney had announced that Derek would face criminal charges including assault and battery, deprivation of rights under color of law, and official misconduct. His lawyer had told him bluntly that the video evidence made fighting the charges nearly impossible. Derek's wife, Sarah, had packed her bags and gone to stay with her sister. She couldn't handle the media scrutiny, the angry protesters outside their house, or the realization that the man she had married was capable of such cruelty. Their neighbors, who had seemed friendly enough before, now avoided eye contact and whispered when Derek walked by. His friends from the department stopped returning his calls. The morning after Marcus's press conference, Derek sat alone in his house scrolling through social media, which was the worst thing he could have done. The comments were brutal and unrelenting. People were calling him a disgrace to the uniform. Veterans groups were demanding the harshest possible prosecution. Local businesses were putting up signs saying he wasn't welcome. His own mother had called him in tears, asking him how she had raised a son capable of such hatred. But what hurt Derek most wasn't the public condemnation or the criminal charges. It was the slow dawning realization that he had been completely wrong. In the quiet of his empty house, forced to confront his actions without the armor of his badge and the protection of his authority, Derek finally began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. He had assaulted a decorated war hero, a man who had given more to this country than Derek ever would, simply because of prejudice he had been carrying around like poison in his heart. A local news station had dug into Marcus's background and put together a feature story. Derek watched it with growing shame. He learned that Marcus had earned not just the Purple Heart, but also a Bronze Star for valor. He learned that Marcus had pulled 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire, taking shrapnel in the process that he still carried in his body. He learned that after Marcus retired from the military, he had helped over 300 veterans successfully navigate the VA system to get the benefits and care they deserved. He learned that Marcus had personally tutored over 50 struggling students, many of whom had gone on to graduate and attend college. Derek had looked at this man and seen only skin color. He had seen only someone he deemed less than himself. He had felt entitled to disrespect, to humiliate, to assault. And now the entire world knew what he had done. And there was video evidence that would live forever on the internet, ensuring that this moment of cruelty would define him for the rest of his life. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away. Derek's lawyer said they could try to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecution was in no mood to be generous. The video had created too much public attention, and the district attorney was facing pressure to make an example of this case. Derek was looking at possible jail time, heavy fines, and a permanent criminal record that would follow him forever. As night fell on that second day after the incident, 2 lives hung in very different balances. Marcus sat with his daughter, receiving calls of support from across the nation. A scholarship fund had been set up in his name to help children of veterans attend college. The governor had called to personally apologize and invite Marcus to the state capitol. Multiple veterans organizations wanted to honor him at their annual events. From humiliation had come recognition, and from injustice had come an opportunity to create positive change. Derek sat alone in the dark, his career destroyed, his marriage crumbling, his reputation in ruins. The badge he had worn with such arrogance was gone. The authority he had abused so casually was stripped away. The future he had imagined was replaced with court dates and public shame. Karma had struck with perfect precision, and the reckoning was just beginning. 3 weeks passed, and the day of Derek's preliminary hearing arrived. The courthouse was packed with people, including veterans in uniform who had come to support Marcus, reporters documenting every moment, and citizens who wanted to witness justice being served. The crowd was so large that court officials had to set up an overflow room with a video feed for those who couldn't fit in the main courtroom. Marcus arrived early, dressed in a neat suit with his military service pins displayed proudly on his lapel. He walked through the crowd with his head held high, shaking hands with fellow veterans who had traveled from neighboring states just to stand with him. Among them was Colonel James Richardson, Marcus's former commanding officer from Vietnam, now 78 years old but still standing straight and proud. "Marcus," the colonel said, gripping his hand firmly, "what they did to you is an insult to every person who has ever worn this uniform. We're here to make sure justice is served." "I appreciate it, sir," Marcus replied, "but I hope people understand this isn't just about me. This is about everyone who has faced this kind of treatment, everyone who has been judged not by their character but by their appearance." Inside the courtroom, Derek sat at the defense table looking haggard. He had lost weight over the past 3 weeks, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His lawyer, a public defender named Thomas Hayes, sat beside him reviewing notes. Hayes had tried to prepare Derek for what was coming, but Derek seemed to exist in a fog, barely responsive to anything happening around him. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Patricia Thornberry was known for being fair but firm, with no tolerance for procedural games or theatrical displays. She had reviewed the case file thoroughly, including watching the video that had sparked this entire situation. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, stood to present the evidence. She was methodical and precise, walking the judge through the timeline of events. She played the video for the court, and even though most people there had already seen it, watching it in the formal setting of a courtroom gave it renewed power. The sound of Derek spitting was clearly audible, as was the stunned silence that followed. "Your Honor," Santos said, her voice clear and strong. "This video shows Officer Derek Thornton committing assault and battery against Marcus Williams, a decorated military veteran who had committed no crime and posed no threat. The evidence is irrefutable. Officer Thornton abused the authority granted to him by the citizens of this community and used his position to commit an act of violence motivated by prejudice." Hayes stood to respond, but his arguments were weak. He tried to suggest that Derek had felt threatened, but the video clearly showed Marcus complying with every instruction. He tried to argue that the spit was accidental, but the trajectory and force captured on camera made that impossible to believe. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as Hayes spoke. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Thornberry interrupted, "I've watched the video evidence multiple times. Unless you have something substantive to present, I suggest you move on to sentencing recommendations." Hayes sat down, defeated. The preliminary hearing moved to the question of bail and trial scheduling. Santos argued that Derek was a flight risk given the severity of the charges and the media attention. Hayes countered that Derek had no prior criminal record and had surrendered his passport. The judge set bail at $50,000 and scheduled the trial for 2 months out. As the hearing concluded, Marcus was asked if he wanted to make a statement. He stood and the courtroom fell silent. "Your Honor, I didn't ask for any of this. I was just trying to live my life, to contribute to my community, to honor the country I served. What happened to me that day was humiliating and hurtful, but it also opened my eyes to an opportunity. This case has become bigger than one incident on one street. It has become a conversation about respect, about justice, about how we treat each other in this country." Marcus paused, looking directly at Derek for the first time. Derek couldn't meet his eyes. "I don't know what was in Officer Thornton's heart that day. I don't know what led him to treat me with such contempt. But I do know that hatred is learned, which means it can be unlearned. I hope that whatever consequences he faces, he also gets the chance to examine his prejudices and become a better person. Because at the end of the day, we all have to live in this community together. We all have to find a way forward. The grace in Marcus's words brought tears to many eyes in the courtroom. Even Judge Thornberry looked moved. Derek, for his part, finally raised his head and looked at Marcus. For the first time since this nightmare began, genuine remorse crossed his face. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," though no sound came out. Outside the courthouse after the hearing, Marcus was immediately surrounded by reporters. But before he could answer any questions, something unexpected happened. A group of police officers in uniform, led by Sergeant Rodriguez, approached through the crowd. "Mr. Williams," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "On behalf of the good officers of the Millbrook Police Department, I want to formally apologize for what happened to you. Officer Thornton's actions do not represent our values or our commitment to serving this community with integrity and respect." Rodriguez then did something that surprised everyone. He and the other officers saluted Marcus, holding the salute with military precision. Marcus, moved by the gesture, returned the salute with the practiced form of a career soldier. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and would become one of the most shared images of the entire incident. "Thank you, Sergeant," Marcus said quietly. "I know there are good officers out there doing difficult work with honor. I've never believed that one bad officer represents everyone in the department." The weeks leading up to the trial saw continued developments. A civil rights organization announced they would be filing a federal lawsuit against the city on Marcus's behalf. The police department implemented new training protocols focused on implicit bias and de-escalation. The mayor established a community oversight board to review police conduct complaints. Derek's life continued to unravel. His house went into foreclosure when he could no longer make the mortgage payments. His wife filed for divorce. His father, a retired police officer himself, publicly disowned him in a newspaper interview, saying he was ashamed to share a last name with someone who had so thoroughly dishonored the badge. Derek moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, working odd jobs for cash because no legitimate employer would hire him after a simple internet search revealed his identity. But something was happening inside Derek during this time. The isolation, the consequences, and Marcus's words at the hearing had cracked something open in him. He started attending therapy, trying to understand the roots of his prejudice. He began reading books about racism and the history he had never learned in school. He watched documentaries about the civil rights movement and the ongoing struggle for equality. It was painful work, confronting the ugliness he had carried inside himself, but for the first time in his life, Derek was truly examining his beliefs and attitudes. Marcus continued his work at the community center and with veterans, but now with added purpose. He started giving talks at police academies and community forums about his experiences, both in the military and as a black man in America. His message was consistent. Change was possible, but it required honest conversation, accountability, and a willingness to do better. The scholarship fund established in his name grew to over $500,000, enough to send dozens of students to college. Companies reached out offering sponsorships. A publisher contacted him about writing a memoir. But Marcus remained focused on his core mission, helping veterans and teaching young people to understand history so they wouldn't repeat its mistakes. As the trial date approached, both men prepared in their own ways. Marcus met with prosecutors to review his testimony. Derek worked with his lawyer to prepare a statement, though Hayes warned him that nothing he said would likely prevent a conviction given the overwhelming evidence. The entire town was bracing for what would happen when these two men faced each other again in court, when the full weight of the justice system would finally render its verdict on that terrible moment when hatred met dignity on a quiet street and the world was watching. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in November. The courthouse had implemented special security measures due to the high-profile nature of the case and the strong emotions it had generated. Metal detectors were set up at every entrance, and extra bailiffs were assigned to the courtroom. Outside, protesters held signs with messages ranging from calls for justice to statements about police accountability and racial equality. The jury selection had taken 3 days. Both sides questioned potential jurors carefully about their views on law enforcement, their experiences with discrimination, and whether they could render a fair verdict despite the viral video they had almost certainly seen. Ultimately, 12 jurors and 2 alternates were selected, a mix of ages, races, and backgrounds that both attorneys hoped would bring balanced perspective to the case. Marcus sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by his daughter Jennifer and Colonel Richardson. He had dressed in his military service uniform for the trial, wearing the ribbons and medals he had earned through decades of service. It was a powerful visual statement that the prosecutors had suggested, and Marcus had agreed. He wanted the jury to see him not just as a victim, but as someone who had given his life to serving the country that one of its officers had treated him so poorly. Derek sat at the defense table in a plain gray suit that hung loosely on his diminished frame. He looked older than his 34 years, his face drawn and pale. When Marcus entered the courtroom in his uniform, Derek's eyes fixed on the medals and ribbons, and his shoulders sagged even further. The reality of who he had assaulted, truly understanding the man's service and sacrifice, hit him again with renewed force. Prosecutor Maria Santos gave her opening statement with controlled passion. She walked the jury through the events of that day, establishing that Marcus had committed no traffic violation, had been completely cooperative, and had posed no threat whatsoever. She explained how Derek had escalated the situation without cause and had ultimately committed assault by spitting in Marcus's face. "This case is about abuse of power," Santos told the jury. "Officer Derek Thornton held a position of trust in our community. He had authority granted to him by the citizens he was sworn to protect and serve, and he violated that trust in the most fundamental way. He used his badge not as a shield to protect the innocent, but as a weapon to humiliate and degrade a decorated war hero who had done nothing wrong." Defense attorney Thomas Hayes had a nearly impossible task, and his opening statement reflected that reality. He couldn't deny what the video showed, so he tried to humanize Derek, to present him as someone who had made a terrible mistake, rather than as a monster. "My client made a grievous error in judgment," Hayes told the jury. "What he did was wrong, and he knows it. But Derek Thornton is not the villain some have made him out to be. He's a man who let his worst impulses control him for one terrible moment. A moment he deeply regrets and will regret for the rest of his life." The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They called Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, who testified about what she witnessed. Her testimony was clear, professional, and damning. She described seeing Derek spit in Marcus's face and noted that Marcus had been completely compliant throughout the encounter. They called the witnesses from the street, including Mrs. Patterson, who testified with righteous anger about what she saw. "That man served his country with honor," she said, pointing at Marcus. "And that officer treated him like garbage. It was disgusting, and I'll never forget it." The young mother who had recorded the video testified about what she captured on her phone. The video was played for the jury multiple times, and each viewing seemed to have the same impact. Jurors shook their heads, frowned, and shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The evidence was undeniable. Then Marcus took the stand. Santos guided him through his testimony with gentle questions, letting him tell his story in his own words. Marcus spoke about his military service, his work helping veterans, his teaching at the community center. He described the day of the incident calmly and without embellishment, simply recounting what happened. "When Officer Thornton spit in my face," Marcus said quietly, "I felt a kind of hurt that went beyond the physical act. I felt the weight of every time I've been judged by my skin color instead of my character. Every time I've been viewed with suspicion instead of respect. I've given 40 years to this country in uniform and another 20 years in service to my community. And in that moment, none of it mattered to that officer. He saw only what he wanted to see." When Hayes cross-examined Marcus, he was respectful, knowing that attacking this sympathetic witness would only hurt his client further. He tried to suggest that perhaps Marcus had misinterpreted Derek's intentions, but Marcus's testimony was too clear and too corroborated by other evidence for that argument to gain any traction. The defense called character witnesses who testified that Derek had been a decent officer before this incident, that he had never had complaints of excessive force or discrimination filed against him. but under cross-examination, Santos got several of them to admit that just because they hadn't witnessed problematic behavior didn't mean it hadn't occurred. Then Derek himself took the stand against his lawyer's advice. Hayes H. had counseled him not to testify, knowing it could only hurt his case, but Derek insisted. He needed to say something, needed to face what he had done publicly. Mr. Thornton, his lawyer began gently, tell the jury what happened that day from your perspective. Derek took a shaky breath. I saw Mr. Williams driving, and something about it bothered me. I told myself I was following proper procedure, looking for traffic violations, but I was lying to myself. The truth is, I saw a black man in an old truck and I made assumptions. Horrible, racist assumptions that I'm deeply ashamed of now. The courtroom was silent. This wasn't the defense testimony anyone expected. I pulled him over without cause. I demanded his documents without explaining why. And when everything came back clean, when I found nothing to justify my suspicions, I got angry. Angry that my prejudices were wrong. Angry that this man hadn't given me a reason to prove my biases correct. So I lashed out in the cruelest way I could think of. I spit in his face. Derek's voice broke and tears streamed down his cheeks. Mr. Williams served this country with honor and distinction. He earned medals for bravery that I can barely comprehend. And I treated him with contempt because of the color of his skin. There's no excuse for what I did, none. I deserve whatever punishment this jury decides to give me. Hayes looked stunned. This was not the prepared testimony they had rehearsed. Santos sat back in her chair, realizing that Derek had just done her job for her. He had confessed fully, admitted to racist motivation, and essentially convicted himself. When Santos cross-examined Derek, she was brief. Mr. Thornton, you say you're ashamed and that you regret your actions. When did this remorse begin? After you were caught on video? After you lost your job? After you faced criminal charges? Derek thought about the question carefully. Honestly, Ms. Santos, the real remorse came later. At first, I was just scared about the consequences. But over these past few months, I've had to really look at myself, at what I believed and why. I've been going to therapy, reading, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could do what I did. The shame is real now. The regret is genuine. But you're right to question it. I questioned it myself. The closing arguments came next. Santos was powerful and concise, summarizing the overwhelming evidence and Derek's own confession. Hayes could only plead for mercy, asking the jury to consider that Derek had shown genuine remorse and was trying to change. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreperson stood and announced guilty verdicts on all counts: assault and battery, deprivation of civil rights under color of authority, and official misconduct. Derek showed no reaction, simply nodding as if he had expected nothing different. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, both sides could submit recommendations and statements. Marcus submitted a letter that surprised many people. In it, he didn't call for the maximum punishment. Instead, he wrote about the importance of rehabilitation, about how Derek's honest testimony suggested someone capable of real change, and about how justice should include the possibility of redemption. I don't want Derek Thornton's life to be destroyed beyond repair, Marcus wrote. I want him to become a better person, to truly understand the harm caused by racism, and to use his experience to help others avoid making the same mistakes. Vengeance doesn't heal communities. Accountability combined with the opportunity for growth does. The day of sentencing arrived. Judge Thornberry had clearly given the matter considerable thought. She acknowledged the severity of Derek's crimes and the breach of public trust they represented. She also noted his full confession and apparent genuine remorse. Mr. Thornton, the judge said, looking down at Derek from the bench, you violated your oath as a police officer. You abused your authority to commit an act of violence motivated by racial prejudice against a man who has served this nation with distinction. These are serious crimes that demand serious consequences. Derek stood, ready to accept whatever came. However, Judge Thornberry continued, I've also read Mr. Williams's letter, and I've noted your apparent sincere efforts toward rehabilitation. Therefore, I'm sentencing you to 3 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if you complete intensive counseling focused on racism and bias. You will also perform 1,000 hours of community service upon release, working with civil rights organizations. You are permanently barred from working in law enforcement in any capacity. Derek nodded, accepting the sentence. As the bailiffs approached to take him into custody, he turned to Marcus, who sat in the gallery. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice clear despite his tears, "thank you for your mercy. I don't deserve it, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." Marcus stood and looked at Derek directly. "We all have the capacity to do better, to be better. I hope you find your way to becoming the person you should have been all along." As Derek was led away, Marcus felt Jennifer squeeze his hand. The trial was over, but the work of healing and change was just beginning. Not just for Derek, but for the whole community that had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and justice. The moment when karma struck had led to this moment of accountability, and perhaps, just perhaps, to the beginning of real transformation.